Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story begins on a Friday. It was already dusk outside and a girl was standing with her boyfriend. He approached her and suggested that we break up. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked again, "Does he really want to do that?" In fact, these were the very words the girl had heard at the party celebrating the return of the Earl of Clermont's second son. This man was Francois Joseph, and he said he no longer wanted to be her fiancé. The girl named Louise was incredibly surprised, and actually thought all his words were the biggest bullshit of her life. Ella looked at him in surprise, then wondered what had gotten into him in the first place. After all, they were already engaged. Francois said in a cold voice that he just didn't love her anymore. At that moment, as if nothing had happened, another girl suddenly came out onto their balcony. She turned to Francois, smiling, and asked why he did not at once tell her the whole truth that they loved each other. This girl was Adelaide de Grand, and when Elle saw her, she was very surprised and could not believe that she was really saying these things. Adelaide, for her part, moved closer to the man, and taking his hand, apologized to her for the way it had all turned out. However, she and Francois love each other, and cannot live when they are not near each other. Elle was so surprised that she couldn't even say a word. She stared at her in surprise, not understanding. Was it really true? Adelaide continued to smile and asked if she was happy for them, that he was finally finding true happiness for himself. Elle clenched her hand into a fist and couldn't understand how she could be pleased. In fact, she hadn't expected to hear more nonsense all evening than this. She was sickened by the two of them. They were shameless, and she didn't understand how anyone could do that to a living person with vulnerable feelings. The girl started to walk away thinking about how they would be worse off just because of this, and she wasn't so out of her mind yet that she was just happy for them. As she walked past her fiancé, she kicked him right in the stomach. Adelaide immediately ran up to Francois, asking if he was all right. She hugged her lover, then turned to Ella, wondering what she was even doing and, more importantly, why. But the girl looked down at them and said that now that she knew of their affair, she was breaking off their engagement. So turning to Francois, she said that she agreed to part. The guy was incredibly upset that she had embarrassed him so badly, and he couldn't say a word back to her. Elle, on leaving, said that he himself should tell the Marquise the news, and also not forget to mention the reason for breaking their engagement. Adelaide, who continued to embrace her lover, began screaming and begging her to stop, and asked in surprise, "Does she really think she's going to get away with this so easily?" She even ordered her to stop, but Ella didn't listen to her and just walked away, wrapped up in her own thoughts. Shortly afterward, the girl returned to the event, which was held in the banquet hall itself. There were a lot of guests there who were having fun and dancing. Two girls immediately ran up to her when they saw Ella, and one of them restlessly inquired why she had returned alone and where Mr. Francois was. The second one also wondered why she had come alone, since they had sort of gone to the garden together. Elle, in turn, stopped, and smiling gently, said that she had just broken their engagement. When the girls heard this, they cried out in surprise, for they had not expected that she could really do such a thing. Then they realized that it must be incredibly hard for her to go through this breakup, and asked how she was feeling in general. Of course, she was very uncomfortable, but she took her drink, which the girl held out to her. The friend said that in any case, she congratulates her, because the girl is now free. She too has experienced something similar in her life, and knows that in such moments, alcohol is the best comrade. Another friend, also putting her hand up, said that she was saying all the right things, so she offered to get drunk to fill that void in her heart from the breakup. All three of them raised their glasses up and, clinking glasses, drank to Elle's release from the unnecessary bonds of marriage. The friends had to force the girl to drink the glass to the bottom, because she did not want to, but still Elle soon emptied it completely. They continued to have fun, and then one of the friends looked away and said that it wasn't easy to approach Mr. Theodore, the protagonist of their empire. And it was true. There were a lot of young people crowded around this man. There were girls as well as other guys who just wanted to talk to him. The friend said that for quite some time the second son of the Earl of Clermont had not shown himself at such events, and they did not know what was the reason for his sudden return. Another friend turned to Ella in a whisper and said that if you thought about it that way, They had gone to the military academy together, and she wondered what he had been like in those years. She also added that if the rumors were to be believed, he looked like a wild dog. The girl got a little embarrassed, and then said that if actually speaking, she didn't really remember much. But no one listened to her friends, for Francois and Adelaide entered the hall, holding hands like true lovers. Her friends immediately started whispering, not understanding how they dared to show up like that. Another girl said that the rumors must have been true, and they didn't understand how these people weren't ashamed to look in the eyes of others. The girls did not expect that Mr. Francois would turn out to be really like that. Elle, in her turn, who was holding another glass of alcohol, put her head down and could not say anything. She was incredibly unpleasant. In fact, the girl had suspected all along that there was more than friendship between them. When she saw him with Adelaide, he couldn't take his eyes off her. She was so beautiful in her silk dress with its bright bows and ruffles that he had only been watching Adelaide the whole time. Perhaps because she thought of him as her fiancé and best friend, Ella tried desperately to shut out everything that was going on. She couldn't believe, even after his confession, that it was true, and the girl, like an idiot, kept clinging to him, unable to give up. She wanted to stay close to him all the time because she really loved him. When they first met, the girl was still at the military academy. Francois came up behind her and bowed and greeted Mrs. Blue. Yeah, he introduced himself and also congratulated her on her safe return to her homeland. The girl immediately approached him, interested in what was happening. Then the man held out his hand to greet her properly. However, Elle got a little embarrassed and said that her hands were all dusty and dirty, so it didn't have to be done. But the man insisted and, laughing, said she needn't worry about that, and immediately took her hand. He brought it up to his mouth and said he was honored to meet someone as amazing as her. Because of that bright smile he gave the girl, she immediately fell in love with him. And now, when Elle drank another glass, she began to feel a little bad. She stepped aside to get some fresh air. Her friends, noticing this, were immediately worried about her, because she was really very drunk. Elle soon left the room altogether, thinking that if she had known this was how it would end, there was no way she would have agreed to marry him. And even though she knew his heart could change, she still couldn't believe that he'd just taken it out on her like that. Ella frantically wishes she could take back the time when his hand was her salvation. She wants to go back to the day she fell in love with his words and his smile. She also thought about the fact that if she had known something like this would ever happen, she would never have allowed herself to fall in love with him. The girl, because she was so upset and was running, gave in to her feelings and did not notice how she tripped, and because of this she twisted her ankle badly. Even through her tears, she began to appeal to the Almighty in the hope that he would hear her request. She asked him to show her some mercy and bring her back that very day. If he really felt even a little sorry for her, she really wanted him to do it. Then the girl was completely overcome with emotion, and she couldn't sit up any longer. She lay down on the grass and, closing her eyes, kept begging to be taken back to that time. As soon as she closed her eyes, she suddenly heard a familiar voice addressing her, saying that because of what had happened, she would be executed. Elle couldn't believe that this was really happening. She didn't know what she had done wrong, but then she thought about the fact that this is all probably some kind of dream. She didn't want to die, and she didn't want to live a life like this anymore. The girl started to scream very loudly, but then she heard someone else's voice. He said that everything was fine, and she didn't have to be afraid. This voice tried to calm her down. Elle couldn't open her eyes and didn't realize who was next to her, but she was glad anyway. The girl started to wake up and realized that it was just a dream. The stranger suddenly ran his hand over her face, wiping away her tears, and asked if she'd had a bad dream. But she was fine now that he was near, so she didn't have to be afraid. Elle immediately opened her eyes, and when she saw a male silhouette in front of her, she was very frightened. She recognized the voice immediately. The girl jumped aside and wondered why she was with him, and in a room she was seeing for the first time in her life. After calming down a bit, Elle turned to Mr. Theodore and demanded an explanation. The girl understood perfectly well that she had just had a nightmare, but she did not understand why she was in the same room with that wild dog Theodore. The man smiled and said hello to the lady. Ella remembered that she had just recently broken off her engagement to Francois, and had also gotten drunk. But it continued to be a mystery to her how she had ended up with this man. Theodore Jean de Clermont, second son of the illustrious knight Count Clermont, and younger brother of Empress Claire Countess Amélie, greeted the girl. She had attended a military academy with this man, and he had been the centerpiece of the celebration at which she had broken off her engagement to her lover. And even though Ella at this gala was completely shattered by what happened, it still doesn't mean she has to wake up in the same bed with another man. Either way, however, she could take some comfort in the fact that all of her clothes were still on, which meant that they had nothing more intimate than that. So the girl immediately turned to Mr. Theodore and inquired what had happened at all. He in turn, looking at her, smiled and asked, "Does she not remember anything?" The man said he had brought her to the place after finding her drunk and unconscious in the garden. When she heard this, she asked in surprise, "Did he really save her?" Elle thought at that moment that she really shouldn't have gotten so drunk last night. If anyone else had seen it, the thought made her shudder. But then she also thought about the fact that no one but Mr. Theodore had even tried to help her, and that even surprised her. In fact, they did spend a lot of time together at the military academy, but she's pretty sure they've never been this close. And this guy goes completely off the rails during the knighting ceremony. He's the so-called wild dog that everybody knows. So Ella was very curious about the reason behind her rescue and why he suddenly decided not to pass by, but to help her. Theodore, when he saw the look on her face, immediately turned and wondered what she was even thinking about. Ella, in turn, thought about the fact that it was far more important for her to understand why this wild dog was suddenly calling her mistress out of the blue. It actually made her feel very uncomfortable, because it was nothing like that between them, and she really hoped it really was. The girl immediately looked under the blanket to be completely sure, and then exhaled in relief, thinking about the fact that she needed to be more careful after all, because if he didn't, it would be a disgrace. Theodore started to move closer to her, and she looked at him in surprise and asked him what he was doing. The man said that even though nothing had ever happened between them, he had held back for so long that even one night wouldn't change anything. He moved closer and closer to her. Elle, in turn, was even glad that there was really nothing between them. She began to stop him with her hands, holding her breasts, and Theodore, in turn, smiling, said that she could anticipate what they had failed to do last night. He began to run his tongue over her lips. She knew he'd saved her last night, but she didn't understand why he was suddenly acting so slutty. When the man reached for her back and said in a greedy voice that he wanted to do this, mistress, Ella realized this was crossing all lines, so she quickly pulled away from him, asking if he had accidentally lost his mind. The man was left lying on the bed, and she in turn started running towards the exit while screaming. She'd actually seen enough assholes in her life, but this was a first for her. Theodore in turn smiled smugly and asked, "Is she really leaving already?" But then he also added that they would meet very soon, so he wasn't saying goodbye. Elle went back to her manor immediately after all this. As soon as she ran into her room, she saw the maid, who was very worried. The maid, upon seeing the mistress, immediately inquired where she had been last night, but then smelled the incredibly strong odor of alcohol. Elle couldn't say anything. She had run so hard that she was out of breath, and she didn't know what to say, how to explain the situation to the nanny. The maid in turn inquired if she had something wrong, for there was clearly something wrong with her face. Elle realized she had to hide the fact that she had spent the previous night in the same room with Theodore, especially since it was right after the breakup of her own engagement. So, laughing nervously, she said that nothing had happened, she was fine, and suggested that they should get ready for work because they couldn't be late. Some time had passed since then, and the maid finally got the mistress cleaned up. When everything was ready, she smiled and said that the girl looked incredibly majestic on this day. She also said that there was no knight in the entire Raon Empire who would be better at conquest than a girl. Elle went to the mirror, and seeing her reflection there, thought about the fact that it was really her. A knight of the Rana Empire, deputy commander of the Knights of November. She is also the heiress of the esteemed Blois, who have always protected the royal family. Then she turned to the nurse and said that she could not grieve forever, and let her take a little more time to realize what had happened. At dawn, she must move on with her life. Ella, lowering her head, said that certainly her engagement had been broken off. And because of the shock, she had thought some nonsense that she could not even explain. Some time had passed since then, and she finally arrived at the training field where she had been swinging her sword for quite some time. The girl was practicing hard, honing her skills, and was not distracted by absolutely anything. She was very focused. But at that moment, Morris with Derry suddenly came up to her and smilingly told her that her sword was still as sharp as ever and wished her a good morning, holding out a towel for her to wipe off her sweat. Maurice was the son of her mother's closest aide, and they had grown up together as if brother and sister. The boy smiled and said he could literally see the Countess in her best years. The girl put the sword aside and said that comparing her to her mother was too much even for him. At that moment, a girl with red hair ran up to them, the very one who had been supporting Elle at the event. She turned to the lady and the gentleman, saying that they had come early that day for some reason. The girl immediately turned in that direction and wished Lady Laverne good morning. When she ran closer, she began to look at Ella with admiring eyes, telling her that she looked much better than she thought she did. Of course, she'd heard how drunk she'd gotten last night at the party, and she was ready to blow the whole thing, she thought. Their November nights are the best at drinking, and after all, she looked just fine now. When Elle heard that, she felt a little uneasy. In reality, Laverne de Lucy was a commoner. However, she was widely known among the knights for her unrivaled information-gathering skills. But she has been unable to get a promotion for years because of her recklessness. When she heard that the news had reached even Lady Laurel's ears, she was surprised, for she was not even at the party. The girl continued speaking and waving her hand, told her mistress that in any case she had hard times ahead of her. Elle looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she meant. Then the girl said that no matter how much the commander favored her, it was all too much. But the girl was silent at once, for Maurice stepped on her foot and she cried out loudly. She immediately turned to him and asked that he explain now what it had just been. She also pointed her sword at him to make her words sound more convincing. Maurice sighed heavily and said that Lady Laurel's long tongue was always a source of trouble. So he said that the first thing the girl should do was to go to her office to find out everything. He also said that even if her main task was to participate in the showdown on the battlefield, she still couldn't constantly increase from paper fiber, so she would have to deal with it all after all. He took Laurel under his arm and told her that they would get back to work and not distract her. When Elle heard all this, she was very surprised, and thought that there must be something strange going on in the office. That's why she needs to go there right away. In fact, she also had a rather bad feeling about it, so she quickly headed indoors and walked upstairs to her office. However, as soon as she opened the door, she noticed that there was nothing in the room. But then the girl assumed that something was wrong, for she took a closer look. Her office, which should have been filled with a huge amount of paperwork, now looked absolutely perfectly clean. So she couldn't understand what was going on and how it was possible. But at that moment she was drawn from her musings by Theodore, who came in behind her and addressed Lady L. The girl immediately turned in his direction, and seeing the man in front of her was very surprised. She started screaming, asking where he had come from. The man in turn smiled smugly and said that he had told her that they would meet again soon, when he took her hand and asked if he could formally introduce himself. Theodore got down on one knee, kissed her hand, and said that last Friday he had been appointed Assistant Deputy Commander of the November Nights. He also gave his name in full. After the official part was over, he looked at the girl and, smiling, said he was honored to work with her and called her mistress again. Ella was incredibly surprised and couldn't say a single word, but at least now she understood why he had called her mistress then. But she wasn't satisfied with this arrangement, so she went straight to the commander to find out the details. The girl opened the door, slamming it shut, and asked what the hell was up with her new assistant. The man who was hosting Lady Laurel said she was just in time. He rubbed the bottle of his expensive wine and said that she was now the deputy commander of the Knights of November, and one could not, after all, leave the assistant seat vacant for so long. But Elle was still incredibly angry and stepped closer to him, asking if he had appointed him without even consulting her. Besides, if she had the right to choose, there was no way she would have chosen this wild man. The commander in turn laughed and said that he understood her upset feelings perfectly. However, This assignment only meant that they all had faith in Lady Ella. The girl calmed down a little and looked at the commander in surprise and asked what he meant by that, for she really didn't understand what it meant. And since the commander said that no matter what Theodore-san's background was, he was still part of the imperial family, so perhaps it wouldn't be so bad if a person like him walked in her aids. But the man laughed and also said that if she made one mistake, she wouldn't wear her head anymore. Elle was very annoyed, and most importantly, that he was meddling in other people's affairs. She sighed heavily and said that she couldn't believe it. So she asked him to change his mind. The man put the wine back on his shelf and said he was sorry, but there was nothing he could do now as the process had already been set in motion. Elle was very surprised to hear this, and asked since when such matters could be resolved so quickly. But at that moment, she turned her attention to the man's actions and didn't understand where he had gotten an entire case of one of the Ron Empire's finest wines. It was a dream wine made only in the Bell region, and now the commander has a whole bunch of it. The commander in turn returned to his conversation with Lady Lovren and inquired where they stood there in general. The girl immediately went back to the papers and began to tell him what they had talked about before Elle came in. Elle herself could not understand how the commander, who always drank cheap alcohol, had a whole collection of such a rare wine. After he resolved all the issues with the girl, he patted her on the shoulder and told her that she needed to keep working hard. He also said that he had high hopes for her, but then she remembered that the barrier region was the Earl of Clermont's territory, and it turned out that someone else had heard about the commander's addiction to alcohol. The Lady of the Laurel turned to Elle and told her that she was on her way too, and said that they would meet again. The girl herself was incredibly angry and ready to kill anyone who crossed her path, but she immediately ran to the Laurel, grabbed her by the shoulder, immediately turned her around and asked, did she really know about all this and just kept quiet? The girl was madly frightened and began to say at once that they knew nothing at all, and now she knew nothing either. And in general, she knew little. But Elle began to coward her body and said that such a thing was simply impossible, for she always knows absolutely everything. It is said that she even knows what color underwear Her Majesty the Empress has on this day. At Lady Laurel, she closed her eyes and said that it was just a silly exaggeration, and she had absolutely no interest whatsoever in the other lady's underwear. Perhaps she would have at least known something if it had been about Mr. Maurice's underwear. But at that moment the door, which opened silently, attracted a lot of attention, and all because Maurice was standing there, and he even dropped all his papers on the ground. The girl who said these words immediately turned, and seeing the gentleman there inquired how long he had been there. The boy was still very confused, and didn't know what to say. Lady Lavra immediately began to justify herself, and said that everything he had just heard was just a misunderstanding. But Elle didn't want to make any excuses, and went straight to him. She stepped closer to him, and kneading her fists inquired if he even knew it to you the assistance of their friend, at which point the back began to gesticulate, indicating about not talking about what he really knew. Morris in turn sighed heavily and said that apparently he had picked a bad time to stop by. Well then, turning to Elle, he said that last evening they had suddenly received an official notice. It stated an urgent matter that could not be delayed. If they could, they would have immediately put this matter aside for later, because the workday was already over. However, the notice had the imperial seal on it, so there was nothing they could do. Elle, when she heard this, was very surprised and couldn't believe that it was really true. She didn't understand since when did the imperial family suddenly interfere in the affairs of the knights, but she was sure it had been done deliberately, just when she was absent. At the party, she thought about the fact that the deputy commander's schedule wasn't easy to get, and if anyone could have open access to her schedule and assist Theodore for his pleasure and interest, it could only be one person. Elle immediately went to this girl, and there in turn sat in her office and ate an apple. As suddenly as a knight came to her and said that a girl named Elsa asked for an audience with her. She immediately asked if she was talking about Lady Ella. The servant waved his head and said that was correct. Then the girl also added that she was curious to know when she was going to visit. But that was even wonderful, so she said she could drop in there. Then the doors in front of Lady Elle finally opened and she stepped inside, moving a little closer to the throne. The girl sat down on one knee. "Greetings, Her Highness." The woman immediately rose from her seat and asked if she liked the gift from the princess, or immediately frowned. In fact, she was not surprised in the least, for she knew very well that it would be hers. As a future empress, already at such a young age, this girl has a wide knowledge of military matters, diplomacy, and even politics. She was a daughter of the Rhone Empire and the royal lady Mary Josephine Claire. She is also known as Princess Pepin. She smiled and wondered if her gift wasn't wonderful. Ella said not at all, and wondered what kind of gift it was. The girl herself didn't know what she was even up to this time. In fact, her gift was her goat, His Majesty the Emperor's nephews, but at that moment, Princess Pepin said that she did not hear satisfaction in her answer, although she would have liked her to behave more aggressively. Elle, in her turn, restrained herself as best she could, for she realized that she must not break down. But the girl smiled and said it was really her gift for her failed engagement. Elle sighed heavily, and thought about the fact that it was like she was just waiting for this to happen. In fact, she was incredibly angry and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Princess Pepin smiled and said that she congratulated her, by the way, because at this rate, she should be making news headlines by now. The front pages of the newspapers had to be about the evil divorcee who had destroyed the Centennial Union. Elle looked at her in surprise and asked what it was all about. The princess took another apple. She didn't even finish it, though, and said that apparently rumors started spreading right in the middle of the party. Everyone was talking about Elle de B being stolen from Francois by Adelaide or something along those lines. Elle was outraged. She got to her feet and said it was ridiculous and asked why there would be such a rumor in the first place. The princess said that that lady was from the Grand family, and she personally would never have thought such a thing about her. But the girl had obviously done a terrible thing. But now Elle's engagement was over in a similar way, and there was new gossip among those who liked to scratch their tongues. Elle became incredibly hurt, for in fact she and Adelaide had actually gotten along incredibly well all this time, and she didn't understand why the girl had done this to her in the first place. But then suddenly the princess asked as Ella raised her head and looked at her. When her knight's honor is disgraced by such stupid things, she just can't stay out of this situation. Anyway, in a way she's angry about the whole thing too, and Princess Pippin doesn't understand how dare she denigrate her knight's virtues. Ella, when she looked at Her Highness, she was very surprised and couldn't believe that she was actually supporting her. The princess cheerfully said that was why she had such a gift for her. Elle was already incredibly angry and could barely filter her speech. And then, what does Mr. Theodore have to do with my broken engagement anyway? Pippin laughed and said that Lady Elle knew absolutely nothing. In such matters, perhaps she is ignorant, yet she can cover up one scandal with another. She looked at her and asked, "What does the girl think of all this? If the wild dog Clermont is under her complete control, won't her broken engagement then fade from the aristocrats' minds as quickly as possible?" Elle, when she heard all this, couldn't believe that the princess had actually thought of such a big plan. The princess continued to eat and said that because Theo made a mess of things and then ran away on Inauguration Day, it was maddening to realize that he had been disinherited so easily. According to her aunt, now that he was back, she would do her best to keep the guy in the place as long as possible. Elle replied that she didn't care about that at all. She didn't understand why she had to appoint him as an assistant. Pippin made a pitiful face and said that as much as she thought about it, the truest person she could trust with the case could only be her sweet and faithful Lady Elle. Elle sighed heavily and thought about the fact that she didn't doubt it one bit. The princess went on and said that she really had no idea how much her aunt had persuaded her, and as she herself knew, she had a very kind heart. The girls were silent for a while, and then Elf asked if it really meant that this person would be her. Pippin smiled and said that was right. Her aunt said that if it was Lady Elle, she would agree to anything. In fact, even if outwardly the imperial family seems unbelievable, they need someone to deal with such nuances. And Elle needs something grand and shocking to overshadow her previous scandal. And now the girl was surprised that it meant that their interests coincided for the first time. She realized that it would not be easy to cover up this scandal. However, in that case, she would at least stay alive. So Elle said that if it were Mr. Theodore, she could not agree to such an offer. Pepin was suddenly surprised and asked if she was really sure she couldn't, if she couldn't do her a favor. The girl put her head down and said that of course she couldn't do that. Then the princess waved her hand and said that it was not easy. She thought that everything was settled and she would not have to waste time on this useless fight. But at this point she stood up and said that the only thing their ladies loved most of all, like everyone else, was of course money. She took Elle's hand and inquired about a 10% pay raise in exchange for this favor. From that moment some more time passed, and Elle finally left her office. Of course, in the end she couldn't refuse the princess's request. At the end, the girl smiled and said that things were much easier if she gave up easily, and you could have just negotiated from the beginning instead of wasting all that time. Elle was incredibly angry about what was happening, but there was nothing left for her to do since it was already a fait accompli. She would take advantage, so she went back to her office. There she was immediately met by Theodore, who had been in the study all this time waiting for the girl. He got up to greet her again. Elsa, going inside, walked forward and said that she had something to say to Mr. Theodore. The man was surprised and immediately asked what it was. Then the girl said that since he was now her assistant, in the future, if he disobeyed her orders, the punishment would be harsher than other nights. The man smiled and said that he understood all this perfectly well and realized he was not even the least bit wary when he heard the girl's stern voice. Elle was surprised, for during his time at the academy, Theodore had given a more sharply unpleasant impression, but apparently his role as a messenger knight had changed him over the years. And she walked to the side to take a seat at her desk and suggested that maybe it wouldn't be as bad as she'd thought it would be. But at that moment she suddenly felt some strange energy. The girl immediately turned around and saw his face right in front of her. Because of that, she was very surprised. Ellie even jumped from surprise and didn't understand when he had managed to get closer at all. Theodore smiled and asked what she was so surprised about. He put his hand on her shoulder. It made the girl very uncomfortable, and she asked that he take his hands off her body now. The man slowly ran his fingers through her hair and said that apparently she was still oblivious. However, he is her dog. So if she wanted to push him away like that, it would just irritate him even more. Elle became very stern and told him to shut up, because she was the one who stopped him when he lost his temper at the inauguration ceremony. And since she had decided to keep him around at the princess's request, it would never happen again. The girl won't let it happen again, so he must remember it forever. Theodore was silent for some time. Then he wondered if she too was afraid of Claremont's wild dog like the rest of them. Or when she heard that, she was very surprised and really wondered herself if she was even afraid of Theodore. And after a bit of thought, the girl realized that she was afraid of something else more than anything else. So she immediately said she wasn't afraid of him at all. A knight has no fear except fear of her master. So she has no one to fear but her master, namely Princess Pippin. Elle said in a stern voice that she was sure he was well aware of that. Theodore put his head down and said that in that case she should tighten his leash. The girl looked at him in surprise. She still couldn't understand why he was talking as if he were an animal, and asked what kind of leash he was talking about. Then Theodore took her hand and put it around his neck, smiling, and said that from now on in any situation she could just call him shortly Theo, all because it would be a leash for a wild dog. After what had happened, the day ended peacefully enough, and Ella went to bed early. That night, however, she had another nightmare. How she was tied to a pole, and everyone was talking about being a traitor, and for her to die and calling her a witch. At its most horrific was when her fiancé approaches her and tells her that she will be executed for mass murder and treason. At this point, fortunately for the girl, she finally woke up with a horrified scream to the whole room. But looking around, she realized that it was a bad dream again. When she looked at her watch, she saw that it was early enough, and she realized that she couldn't fall asleep. So Elle decided to go downstairs to take a little walk. As soon as she came down, she immediately saw the maid, who was already working in the kitchen, and seeing the lady, she said that she was already awake. This actually surprised her. The girl herself said that she couldn't sleep well because of the nightmares that plagued her. So she decided to take a little walk to drive the bad thoughts away from her. The maid smiled and said she understood now. The elf went to the table and picked up the newspaper, and the nanny told her to sit down because she would make her breakfast a little earlier than usual, since she was already awake. The girl agreed and then sat down at her desk. Then she began to read the newspaper, and on the first page she saw her face, and the headline that the Clermont wild dog had been appointed assistant to Elle de Blois. Elle thought about the fact that just as her ladyship had said, her broken engagement had been forgotten, so it pleased her that all the people switched immediately to the other news. But when she remembered Theodore, she thought about the fact that he had only caused her more stress, and suddenly she no longer wanted to go to her favorite job that she used to happily run to. Soon afterward, the maid put some plates on the table and told the lady that there would be roast and baked bread for breakfast, and requested that she should eat, by all means, everything. Elle thanked her for that, then asked the nanny if she had ever dreamed of her own execution. The maid was very surprised when she heard the question. She thought for a while, and then she said that it was hard for her to answer that question, because she especially didn't remember her dreams. Elle was a little upset, because she wanted her to give her advice, but she said it was okay. But then the maid said that she had heard somewhere that if you dream of death, it is good luck, and that a dream is a dream. So you should not give it so much importance. It is only in your head. Ella started eating her breakfast and thought about the fact that the reason she had been having nightmares lately was due to excessive fatigue amidst stress. She decided that she would feel better once she had eaten and regained her strength. She ate her breakfast quickly. Then the maid looked at her in surprise and asked if she was hungry. Ella realized that she had forgotten even all her maneuvers and laughed nervously and told the babysitter that her meat roast was incredibly delicious, so it was impossible to even tear herself away. When the day came, the girl arrived at work quite late. She was met at the front door by Maurice. He was reading a book and said that she was already 20 minutes late for work. Elle just stared at the wall and said she knew it perfectly well and wondered what would happen to her, since she was the boss herself. So she asked him not to bother her. In fact, it's been 2 whole days since Theodore was appointed as her assistant, and she's freaking out about it, because it's her own office and she doesn't want to go in there. Maurice smiled and said that he hadn't realized their lovely Elle could be afraid of anything, and wondered how she could even be afraid of her own assistant, who seemed to be supposed to be helpful. Then the girl took a few steps back and said that she was really afraid of Mr. Theodore. The man didn't expect her to admit the truth. He thought she would start to get out of it, so he was surprised. But at that moment, Elle turned to him and suggested that they just switch helpers. She didn't think it would be much of a problem. Maurice, when he heard this, immediately closed the book and said that it was already too long and he should go to work himself. He didn't really want to exchange any helpers. The guy handed her a book. It said that there were no bad dogs, and he said it was a gift for her. Ella looked at the cover and wondered why he was giving it to her. The guy started to walk away and said no one knows. Perhaps one day she might even find it very useful and help her solve some problems. After that, he said goodbye and left. Ella was incredibly angry at this point, because she assumed that he really enjoyed making fun of her and her difficult situation. But the man didn't move far away, and remembering something, immediately turned around and told Elle not to forget that there would be a special event for all the knights that day. When the girl remembered this, she got very angry, because she disliked this kind of event more than anything else, and it annoyed her. She turned back to the door and thought about the fact that pretty soon she was definitely going to lose her mind for one reason or the other. She stood there for a while, and then she thought about the fact that she should just go in and not think about anything. Just as she was about to open the door, she was beaten to it. It was Theodore. He immediately opened the door and was surprised to see the girl and asked why she didn't come in. Ella jumped up from surprise and said that he had frightened her, so she asked him not to do it again. The man stepped back a few steps and wished her a good morning, or started to enter the office and greeted him and thought that she would like it to be a good morning. But to do so, she would have to remove one person from her office. Then she went a little further and turned to him and said that she had been meaning to ask him something for some time and wondered why she was his mistress. Theodora, however, interrupted her and said that she was wrong again, for he had told her to call him by his incomplete name. Elle sighed heavily and called him by his proper name now, and still wondered why he thought she was his mistress. Theodore went further and said that simply because mistress was his mistress. The girl still didn't understand anything, so she asked him again what he meant. In fact, she was well aware that he was just trying to confuse her in this way and slip away. Theodore continued to remain silent and only smiled. Then the girl said that let's say they went to the military academy together. However, the reason why he suddenly started calling her mistress was unknown. But Theodore only repeated the same phrase. Then the girl decided to approach from the other side and said that as an aristocrat of the highest rank, why did he even choose to become the assistant deputy commander? The man smiled and said it was all about Miss L. It was starting to get annoying, and she shouted at him to stop saying that. After taking a few breaths, she turned to Mr. Theodore and said that honestly she didn't care at all what he thought of her, but from now on he should call her Lady L instead of mistress. But the lad lifted his head up and, closing his eyes, said he refused to give it up. L didn't understand what was even going on and decided that she was really going to lose her mind right now because of what was happening. You and him are just impossible to dialogue with. Theodore was silent for a while, then said that in any case, he would work hard for her from today, so she was above him sheepishly under any circumstances. The man stepped closer to her and said he was so agitated he hadn't even slept all night. Elle was wary and asked him to move away from her, to keep his distance, but the man only began to move even closer to her. Then she stepped aside and asked him how dare he disobey her orders at all. Theodore continued to move closer to her while smiling happily. Then Elle had to stop him with her hands already, and she thought about the fact that he was dangerous. But surely she had expected that such a situation could happen. So she prepared herself for such an eventuality. The girl was quickly able to group herself and put the man on the floor face down so he wouldn't molest her again. Theodore glimpsed at her, then wondered if she was trying to rein him in. Elle continued to hold him very tightly and said that he understood perfectly well, so she didn't think it was necessary to explain herself. She squinted and said she'd heard about him showing no interest in anything that didn't entertain him, and wondered if he was really that interested in her. Elle was very surprised. She was holding him quite tightly, but she didn't understand why on earth he wasn't even resisting and acting even relaxed. Then she shifted her gaze to his smile and realized that this idiot was really enjoying this kind of thing. The girl looked away and saw that it was her cloak, and it was lying on the floor. So she decided to pick it up. But suddenly Lady Laurel came into her office without knocking. She ran into her room and said she was going to head to the main office now. But seeing what Elle was holding the man on the floor by force, she was very surprised. Lady Laurel immediately turned aside and wondered if she had distracted them. She felt very uncomfortable about the situation. Ella, when she saw her, lifted Theodore to his feet and pushed him aside. Turning to the girl, she said just in time for her to arrive. Theodore in turn picked up her coat and wondered why she was always snapping at him specifically. Come all he wanted was to take the cloak away from his mistress. When Aaliyah heard about it, she was very surprised and even blushed. She saw a red spot on the man's neck because she was holding him hard. She felt very ashamed because she had not even thought about it. Elle then turned to Lady Laurel, who had already gone inside, and inquired if she remembered correctly that the girl had said she was on her way to the main office. The girl immediately confirmed that information. Then Elle turned to Mr. Theodore and told him to go with Lady Laurel and at the same time to look at the documents she had placed in his hands. The man was very surprised and asked if he had to do it now. She said it had to be done right now because it was a great opportunity for him to learn about the work of the senior fellows from Lady Laurel herself directly. Elle herself at that moment thought that this was also a great chance to get rid of him at least for a while. Theodore took the documents from the girl, saying that since his mistress ordered him to do it, he would do it. Elle was very angry that he started calling her mistress again, but she realized that he would not agree otherwise, and told him that she was ordering him like a mistress. When the man heard those words, he smiled smugly, because everything was going the way he wanted it to. But the girl went on in a very serious voice, saying that if such a thing was at all possible, he should learn all he could, and inquired if he understood what she wanted him to do. Theodore did not take his eyes off her, and smiling told his mistress that he understood her perfectly and would try to do his best. So the man went with Lady Laurel to the main office. In order to get there, they had to go down A Street, where the sakura blossom season was just around the corner. They walked in silence for some time, and the girl kept examining him with wonder. Theodore felt her gaze on him perfectly, and wondered if she had something to say to him. Then the girl turned in a trembling voice and said that he was indeed irresistible, as everyone had said he was. Lady Laurel smiled and said that if he smiled the way he smiled at Lady L, she was sure he could win over a great many girls. The man asked if she really thought so, and then she also added that he thought she was more interested in Mr. Morris than in him. When the girl heard about it, she was very surprised and asked him how he knew about it. She asked him if he could read minds. Then, without waiting for an answer, she said that it was incredibly cool. Theodore did not respond to this in any way, for he realized that she would still make up many unimaginable things. When the girl asked why Lady L was suddenly his mistress, the man pondered for a while, then said it was rather difficult to explain. Perhaps there were several reasons for it, but for him, only L de Blois could be his mistress. When he said that, his eyes shone as if he was sincerely in love with this girl. Lady Laurel noticed this at once and said that she was really the same, that for her only Morris could be a gentleman. And smiling, she said that apparently they were very much alike. Theodore did not object and said that apparently it was indeed so. Some more time passed, and then they finally arrived at the main office building. It was quite large, but rather modest. The girl walked forward and said that he should be on his guard from now on, because their senior colleagues were very picky. At this moment, Ella was sitting in her office and could finally exhale a little. She opened the book Maurice had given her and thought to herself that she must be completely insane. After all, whatever Theodore did, he was still a human being. But she did open the book, and the first thing it said was the importance of walks. After all, every dog in the world loves walks. They help to relieve stress, to find a common language with other dogs. It is a natural necessity for both psychological and physical health. Ella, when she read about it, immediately thought about going for a walk. She assumed that he might behave much better if he took a walk, which was why she had sent him along with Lady Laurel. In fact, because of the nightmares, she hasn't been able to sleep properly, so now she feels incredibly tired. The girl thought about the fact that they would need some time to negotiate with those horrible aristocrats. So she decided that she could take a nap, to regain some of the strength she had. However, as soon as she leaned back against the headboard and closed her eyes, the door immediately opened, and Lady Laurel ran into the room and said she felt incredibly relieved, and turning to Ella said they were already back. The girl immediately jumped, for she had not expected it to happen so quickly. Laurel said that she still couldn't believe that they had been able to agree so quickly, thanks to Mr. Theodore. The man in turn looked at her and said that none of that was true, and he was only following Lady Ellie's instructions and nothing more. Elle turned to them and said that they had both done a very good job. She wondered what they were talking about, because she really didn't know what they were talking about. Lady Laurel stepped closer to her and said she would explain everything now. When she said that, as soon as they arrived at the main office, the freaky weirdos froze with fear at the mere sight of Mr. Theodore. And at that moment, it was as if a whole weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She ran to the side and said that she needed to show off to Morhusa-san as soon as possible. So she left. Elle continued to sit still and thought about how even Lady Laurel was constantly exhausted after another report at the main office. But that wasn't the case at all right now. When she looked at Theodore, who sat smugly at the table and began to go through the papers, the girl didn't understand what he could even do, that even these harmful aristocrats didn't show their turbulent emotionality. She sighed heavily and thought about how hard it was for her to admit it. But even he could be useful, and she'd thought he was a total slacker who couldn't do anything. She looked around and thought that her office, which had been cluttered with mountains of papers, was suddenly very clean. In a way, she even felt sorry for him, because he'd taken care of all the paperwork himself, and there was a lot of it. Elle had been looking at his body the whole time, and saw that she had left a few bruises on his wrist and neck. The man, in turn, felt her gaze, and smiling, looked back at her. She felt very uncomfortable, so she immediately looked away, and really hoped he didn't notice her looking at him, because that would have been too uncomfortable. So Elle decided to catch a glimpse to see if he was looking at her. But when their gazes made contact, She didn't understand why he kept staring right back at her. Undoubtedly, the girl was being overly strict with him. She could still see the red marks on his neck. But still, she didn't understand why he didn't take his gaze away from her even for a second. She decided to drink some water to rest and realized that even a simple sip was difficult for her because he was watching so greedily. Due to her carelessness, Elle spilled some water on her cheek and started licking it off with her tongue to avoid getting her hands dirty. And turning to the side, she saw that Theodore was still looking at her. The girl couldn't believe that he was watching her do these things. This made her very angry, so she stood up, striking her hands to the apostle, thinking that she could not go on like this. So she turned to Mr. Theodore and said that she was done with work for the day. The man looked at her in surprise and asked why that was so. After all, he still had to look at that theft case she had assigned to him. Ella moved closer to him and told him that she would only let him get used to the paperwork this week, so he could take it easy. She smiled and said it was because he was going with her to patrol the streets. That was more important than sorting out all the thefts. Shortly thereafter, they got together and were out on the streets of the city doing patrols after all. Theodore, looking around, wondered if he remembered correctly that she had said that if they went further, they would come to Avenue Street. He then pointed to the side and asked if that was the shortcut to the street. The girl stopped and said that it was, and added that she was surprised that he had a good sense of direction. Elle explained that the neighborhood was under the Knights of November, and for the most part, the place was populated by affluent people. The streets here are quiet. However, it is still impossible to be vigilant. So when various crimes occur in this place, she also said that from now on, he would go out and patrol the streets more often. Theodore immediately looked at her and asked, "Is it really just the two of them that will be attending this assignment?" The girl agreed and said that it was only unless there was a special occasion. They would be patrolling in pairs mostly. The man moved closer to her and asked with a smile on his face if he was correct in realizing that it would only be the two of them on such outings. Elle understood his implication. However, in a cold voice she agreed, and said that it was correct. There would only be two of them. After that he moved away and smiling smugly, they walked on. The girl glanced at him and noticed that he was in a good mood. At that moment, she remembered a passage from a book that said, "Every dog loves a walk." She assumed that the book would probably do more good than she thought. They walked farther and farther away, when suddenly Ella heard some strange noises around the corner. She immediately turned to the side and asked what was going on there. Theodore was very worried and turned to his mistress, asking if everything was all right. The girl herself did not take her eyes off the darkness that could be seen in the distance. Ella grabbed her weapon and was ready. Then she saw some sort of red dot appear in the darkness and became even more wary. But at that moment, a small gray kitten came out from behind a dark alley, and at the sight of the people, it meowed happily, hoping to be fed. Elle put the weapon back in its sheath and asked in surprise, "Is it really just a cat?" Theodore smiled and said that she was, on top of everything else, also cute. Kitten began to wash his body, as if it would get very dirty in those few seconds, and Elle turned to Theodore, telling them to move on. They went on to patrol the streets further. But in fact, what was really lurking in that darkness was the silhouette of a man who exhaled with relief after they left. When it started to get dark outside, they were still patrolling. Elle said she must be losing her grip, since she thought the kitten was some kind of criminal. "Well," Theodore said smiling, "that it's all because the neighborhood is quiet, and she may not always be alert." But the girl disagreed with him and said that it was not necessary at all. They have a thief who has been bothering them for some time now. The man, when he heard about it, was immediately interested. Then Elle explained that his name was Zephyr, and he was robbing the houses of aristocrats in the area. But they never managed to track him down. That's why the Knights gave him that particular name. Theodore, on hearing this, inquired, "If this is really Zephyr, are they really talking about the god of the west winds?" The girl said that was absolutely correct. It's a nickname he got for his ability to move like the wind. She knows it's for a reason, but as she expected, no trace of him could be found. Theodore looked at the sunset and suggested, "A little more walking around the neighborhood just in case." But the girl suddenly stopped and said that there was no need for that, so she decided to finish the patrol already. The man, when he heard about it, was very surprised and asked why this was so. She took the bag off her shoulder and said she thought the workday was about to end, so there was no point in overworking. Theodore became indignant and said that he actually wanted to walk with her some more. He looked so upset, as if she had broken his heart. Elle, at that moment looking at his pitiful look, thought that he was really acting like a dog who hadn't had enough and wanted to play on the grass. But she smiled at him and told him that they'd been around this street twice already and wondered if he still wasn't tired. Theodore waved his head and said that he wasn't tired at all. He was ready to go around the area a few more times, but Elle replied that by the next patrol, he had to memorize everything they had seen in the meantime. She wanted to say something else, but didn't have time, because some man ran into her, knocking her down and taking her bag that was hanging on her shoulder. It all happened very quickly. Elle couldn't even orient herself where to hit, but only heard Theodore's voice anxiously addressing her. Elle couldn't stay on her feet because she twisted her leg and fell to the ground. Theodore immediately ran up to her and asked if she was all right. Ella replied that she had fallen because her leg was still sore from the party. He looked incredibly worried and asked her to let him examine her ankle, because it could be something serious. However, the girl replied that she was perfectly fine, and he needn't worry. Then she shifted her gaze to the crowd and said, all the more reason for her bag to be stolen. Theodore, hearing this, turned to the side and told the lady that she needed to be taken to the doctor immediately. She started shouting at him and told him not to worry about her health and to run after the thief as soon as possible to take her bag from him. She also said that this person might be Zephyr. Theodore was still worried and didn't know what to do. He wanted to stay with the mistress and help her, but the girl suddenly started shouting and said that this was an order. He must go and catch this rascal and bring him to her. Theodore was very indignant at this, but then he gathered all his will and anger into a fist and ran, saying that he obeyed his mistress. He ran as fast as he could and thought that the man could not have run far. Then he saw the black cloak around the corner and realized that it was the thief. The villain ran around one corner, and Theodore decided to outsmart him and run off on the other side in order for them to meet at the same spot. And so, when the villain finally turned the right corner, Theodore pounced on him and began swinging his sword in order to finally stop him. However, the man had very good coordination and was able to dodge. And before that blow, Theodore, when he saw it, he was very surprised. You see, he usually never missed. And so, while he was landing on the ground due to straight-up jumping on this man, the man started to run away. Theodore was incredibly angry, and he wondered if the boy really thought he would give in to him. He immediately ran after the thief and made various maneuvers to catch up with him. Then the villain suddenly screamed when he realized that the man's foot was flying straight at him and asked him to stop. But it was too late. Theodore hit him very hard on the head. He flew aside a few meters and fell to the ground, unable to get up again. When the man landed on the ground, he approached the thief and wondered how he even dared to touch his mistress. He was so close and had already swung his sword to kill and punish the villain, when suddenly he started screaming for mercy. But at that moment, Theodore heard the familiar voice of the mistress asking that he stop as well. The man immediately turned in her direction, and seeing the lady, inquired in surprise what she was doing here. The girl in turn said that it would be enough. She couldn't believe that he had mastered these streets so quickly, and smiled, and said that he could learn quickly enough. At this point, he shifted his gaze to her feet and asked how that was even possible. Ella smiled in turn and said that, as he could see for himself, she was completely fine. At that moment, Morris appeared behind her, and smiling happily, said that the novice initiation party was that special event not to be missed among the nights of November. The girl sighed heavily and said that this was exactly what happened now. The guy who turned out to be the thief started to take off his hood to show that he wasn't who Theodore thought he was. The man turned to his colleagues and said that it all made sense now. He had lured him to the bar where all the other knights were gathered, and Elle had pretended to twist her leg so she wouldn't have to run after him. The girl said in a sad and serious voice that she was sorry, but she had to cheat after all. But they've all been through it at least once, so he doesn't have to be upset, because everyone understands his feelings. Then Maurice said that if you think about it that way, Elle had cut the thief off before he could even lead her to the bar. The girl smiled and said that was indeed once upon a time. But it didn't really matter now. She reached forward to Theodore and said that now that they had gotten this far, she could no longer ignore him. The girl addressed him as Mr. Theo and said that it was now official that she could now welcome him into the ranks of the Knights of November. She also said that once again she hoped for their friendship. Theodore accepted her helping hand and said that he similarly hoped so, and thanked her for being on time. He caught a glimpse of the disguised thief and said it was a good thing she had run up so quickly, for he had almost done something irreparable. Elle turned to the men and suggested that they go inside, since they were already expected. Maurice looked at Theodore in surprise and couldn't understand what he was talking about when he called what he had done irreparable. She walked forward and then remembered the disguised thief. The girl turned to him, calling him Jerome, and said that he had done well too. Very realistic acting he had. Jerome at this point became very indignant. He said in a trembling voice that it wasn't a game at all. This guy had actually tried to kill him. He looked at Theodore in horror and couldn't believe that if she hadn't come, or if she had been late, he wouldn't even be alive. But it was soon resolved, and they finally walked into the place where they were to celebrate the man's initiation into knighthood. As soon as the door to the tavern opened, they were immediately greeted by Lady Laurel, who carried plates into the room to make sure there was enough for everyone. When she saw them, she rejoiced and said hello, saying that she thought they would die before they got there. She said hello to Lady L and Mr. Theodore. The girl in turn apologized for being late, but she said they had a matter to settle. Then she asked if everything had gone well and as planned. Maurice smiled and gave a thumbs up, saying that everything had been fine and he had done quite well. Lady Laurel was even a little upset and said that she had to see it for herself, for she was sure it was a sight to behold. Then they went inside, where the knights were already assembling and setting all the dishes on the table. Ella, looking around, suddenly wondered to the girl where the commander was, since she couldn't see him. Laurel, who was carrying a stack of plates, said he showed up but then left, going to help with the marshmallow case. When the girl heard that, she was very surprised and asked why he was the one who went there. She explained that the jeweler had fixed the broken necklace, and Her Majesty the princess. He thought that the marshmallow might be after the jewelry, so he asked the commander for help. But in fact, among the nobles right now, he was also a complete nut. Perhaps the commander is now in the palace and heading straight for us, or he may still be doing his own thing. Suddenly one of the knights who was sitting nearby put his empty beer glass on the table and said that this marshmallow was that fruit. Elia immediately looked at him. The man said that a thief is a thief. He steals other people's things. He gives them to poor children. But that doesn't make his actions legal. Maurice laughed and wondered if they were here to talk about work. He turned to Theodore and Ella, and with a smile on his face, said that it would be a good idea for the two of them to sit down first, to lighten the load a little. Elias stepped aside and told him to sit next to the guy who'd been talking about the marshmallows. Theodore turned to the guy and asked him if he could sit here. He was a little embarrassed, but said that of course he could, because the seat was free. Some more time passed, and at last all the food, snacks, and drink were ready. It was all brought to one huge table, where the knights were already seated waiting for the meal. Then Maurice spoke up and said that before their lovely party began, he wanted Ella, their deputy commander, to say a few words on behalf of the command. The girl did not much like the idea, however. There was nothing to be done. She stood up, glass in hand, and said that, as they all knew, they had gathered in this place on this day to welcome Mr. Theodore as the newest member of their team. That was why she hoped that after this initiation ceremony, they would finally be able to get to know him better. In fact, the girl hated speeches like this more than anything else, so she was always very nervous when she spoke. Also, Elle thought about the fact that he is the son of an earl and also a member of the imperial family, so they would have to be douchebags not to offend him. The people in turn agreed with her and said that they would do their best to be nice. Then the girl raised her glass up and said that she wanted to raise this fine drink to Mr. Theodore, who had officially joined the Knights of November. Everyone immediately began to shout loudly and cheer. Even someone sang a song. They clinked glasses and drank it all down. She sat down next to Theodore and took small sips of her beer, while he watched her without taking his eyes off her. Some more time passed. All the people sat happily eating, talking about various everyday things. Ella, however, sat silent, observing this atmosphere. She noticed that the whole mood of the people was different compared to other gatherings. It was quiet enough for an initiation party. People were just sitting around, eating, and even whispering. After that, she looked at Theodore, who also looked quite serious, and realized that he was of imperial blood, an earl's son, and also the protagonist of the unpleasant rumors. So it was no surprise to her now that when he sat at the table there was such an awkward, silent atmosphere. They just didn't accept him as family. Lady Laurel, who was withdrawing and finally returned to the hall, came up to Maurice and began to question why everyone was quiet, and asked if she could sit next to him, for there was an empty seat. Ella, watching what was happening, thought about how they were actually more outgoing, just like her. But things were different now. Laurel turned to one of the men and thanked Mr. Theodore for helping her out. The guy who was sitting next to her was very surprised and asked what it was all about because he really didn't understand. Then she explained that she had to go with a report to the head office of one collegium that day. Elle sent Mr. Theodore along with her. When people heard this, they were immediately interested. One of the knights asked if the two of them had gone to meet those hypocrites, and also inquired how it had gone, for she had heard that it was impossible to get away from them before the end of the day. Ella stood up from the table at this point, thinking about the fact that she shouldn't worry about it anymore, because Lavra was in this place, which meant that everything would be under control. The girl could get anyone to talk, even a dead person. She decided that she might as well leave now, for she was even a little tired of all this sitting around. Theodore, who was sitting next to her, suddenly noticed that she had started to leave and was immediately interested. The man turned to Ella, who had not yet made it out the door, and wondered where she was even going. The girl immediately stopped. She didn't think anyone had noticed she was leaving, but when Theodore said that, all the warriors who were sitting at the big table immediately started looking at her with surprised looks. They really didn't understand where she was going in the middle of the feast. Elle became uneasy, and she didn't understand why everything was happening now. After all, Theodore had called her mistress, and people would immediately start thinking something not okay, and he in turn kept looking at her and treating her like a mistress. People immediately began to chatter, not understanding why he was calling her mistress. Some even assumed that he had called Lady L, the squad leader. Theodore in turn smiled smugly and began to repeat the question over and over again. Where was she going? And he kept calling her his mistress. Then one of the knights shouted out that it was right. It was true that Theodore had called her mistress. Elle was so embarrassed that she even blushed. She thought about what she should have told him not to call him that in front of the other knights, and realized she'd really screwed up. For the knights suddenly turned to the deputy commander and wanted to ask something. The girl didn't turn around. She was too embarrassed, and she didn't want this to happen at all. One of them, when she ignored him, said in a sad voice that she didn't notice now because they were new. The other man replied that he didn't think she was like that. Elle immediately turned around and called them idiots, saying that it was completely wrong. But at this moment, Lady Laurel intervened in the conversation and wondered if it might be a sort of game, for she had caught one interesting scene in her study when she first came in. The man, when they heard this, immediately started puking and shaking with fear. He said it was impossible. He was very offended that the deputy commander was doing such a thing. Ella started shouting, asking for them to finally listen to her and understand. However, the other guy pointed his finger and asked why else then, a representative of the imperial family, she wanted the deputy commander to be a mistress. The girl paused for a while. She was shocked. After all, this argument was really good, but she realized that she had to get out of this situation somehow. So with a heavy sigh, she was about to make something up. But then, suddenly, Mr. Theodore intervened in the conversation and said that he was indebted to Lady L. When the girl heard this, she immediately looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he said this, for up until now, she had run away from answering questions of this kind. Then one of the boys asked how the highest aristocracy could be in debt, and then asked the deputy commander what Theodore owed her so much. Elle laughed nervously and said she was curious herself, and asked that they ask Theodore herself, for she herself did not know what he owed her. The boys immediately turned in his direction, and with eager eyes began to wonder why things were the way they were. Elle, in turn, thought about the fact that asking him directly is a bit dangerous video. He might get very angry. But she had no other choice, because she didn't know what to say to him. There was a very awkward and rather long silence in the room. She realized that when it came to talking directly to Theodore, there was no one willing to do so. They were all afraid of him, shy even. But she thought about the fact that no matter how it went, she needed to get out of this place as soon as possible, before others started asking even more awkward and uncomfortable questions. At this point, Lady Laurel set her glass on the table and wondered why they shouldn't play a game. Really, it would diffuse the situation, and the whole truth could be known. Then she looked at Theodore and said that he was, after all, the centerpiece of the celebration. So in order to get to know him better, each of them would ask him a different question, to which he would have to answer only the truth. People, when they heard this, immediately became anxious and asked if it was necessarily for them to do this. In fact, they were still afraid of him and did not understand him. But Lady Laurel smiled and said that your answer, Theodore, as punishment for an unanswered question, would be drinking a glass each of her special cocktail. She started looking for something in her purse, and said that she had brought a secret ingredient to improve her drink many times over anyway. When Ella heard about it, she immediately hesitated, because she realized that she was probably talking about a special cocktail of hers. At that moment, the girl took out an expensive wine and showed it to everyone present. Then Maurice, when he saw it, immediately asked anxiously where she had gotten this drink from. The girl smiled and said that there were actually too many in the commander's office, so she took one bottle from him. People, when they heard this, immediately began to whisper, and they all had the same thought that it was not at all surprising that she failed her exam every year and could not rise higher in rank. Then one girl who was sitting at this table said that drunks are all different. If they want to get close by drinking together, the game. Really, it's the best option. The guy who sat next to her said it would be quite fun anyway, so very much a good idea. At this point, everyone immediately began to look pitifully at Elle for her approval of this game. The girl in turn turned to Theodore and asked him if he agreed with Lady Lauren's proposal. She at this moment thought about the fact that Theodore would still say that he didn't like it. So she shouldn't worry, she would be gone soon enough. But to her surprise, the man smiled and looked at her and said that he didn't mind the game. When Ella heard this, she sighed heavily and began to take off her cloak, because she realized that she was not going anywhere. The girl thought about the fact that he was really, apparently, as naive as he was. Then she turned to the others and said that since he didn't mind, they could play a little of this game. The people were immediately happy that she agreed. But at that moment Maurice turned to her in a quiet voice and inquired if she was sure, for they say that a special cocktail Laurel can down a single glass. She sat back in her seat and said he was just as human as anyone else. It was just that the royal family didn't know how to have as much fun with alcohol as they did, so nothing would come of one glass. At that moment, Lady Laurel immediately began to stir her magic cocktail, which was incredibly high in alcohol, so strong as well. Plus, Elle, looking at how the warriors happily began to help her, said to Maurice that in addition to everything should not spoil such a pleasant atmosphere. After all, they had just relaxed at last. Elle started drinking her beer, and thought about the fact that if there were any questions, they wouldn't be able to talk directly to Theodore anyway, much less ask more personal questions, so she might as well not worry. When everything was ready, Lady Laurel said that in that case she would ask him the first question, and the girl looked at Theodore and asked if he liked Lady Elle. When Elle heard this question, she even choked on her drink. The girl covered her mouth with her hand so that no one would see the beer spilling out of her mouth. Moore, who was sitting next to her, immediately turned to her, asking if everything was all right. Theodore, however, at this moment took out his black napkin, and holding it out to the girl, told her to take it, for she'd gotten a little dirty. Dell looked at him in surprise and thanked him in a cold voice, but she couldn't understand why he was acting like this, because he was usually more secretive. The men immediately began to whisper, not realizing what the atmosphere was, and assumed that there was something between them anyway. Then one of the men asked that Theodore answer the question now. Apparently, it was indeed insanely interesting. Then Theodore began to answer Lady Laurel's question, and said that of course, But he did not have time to finish the sentence because Elle asked him not to answer, but just to drink. People immediately began to stare at the couple in amazement, for they were incredibly curious. One of the men asked Theodore to keep talking because they wanted to hear the whole truth. Then the man smiled and said that no matter how many people asked him, he always answered one thing. Lady Elia. He did indeed. But he did not have time to finish the sentence again, because the girl began to shout at him and said that it was an order, he should not answer, but drink. The man had nothing else to do. He took this fine drink and, lifting it up, said that indeed he must obey, for she was his mistress. When he started to take a sip, but after that he didn't have time to stop and drank the whole glass, saying that they knew how to spoil him. Lady Laurel turned to Morris at this point and said that it was very sad, for she had thought they were in for something interesting, and she was quite sure that he meant to say the L word. Morris laughed nervously and said they couldn't know for sure. Elle looked angrily at the girl at this point and thought about the fact that when they walked out of this tavern, she wouldn't live. Theodore in turn turned to his mistress and placed the empty glass on the table. He said that it was incredibly delicious and also laughed. The people present, when they saw that he had emptied the whole glass, were very surprised. They thought he would take a few sips and give up immediately. Lady Laurel in turn turned to him and said that this was her special cocktail. It is a masterpiece, the recipe of which has been handed down from generation to generation. Elle in turn looked surprised at all this. Then she said she wanted to ask him how fast he was getting drunk just in case. She had actually asked the question, for she had noticed that his eyes were already glassy, and he himself looked somehow strange. It took the man a while to think about the question. Then he said that he did not know, because he had never counted when he drank. Elle sighed heavily and thought about the fact that this was a royal offspring after all, and they had alcohol running through their veins, so she was worrying for nothing. But at that moment, the man finished his sentence, saying that he didn't count because he always got drunk to his heart's content. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. One of Laurel's colleagues in turn replied that it was very fine, and in that case they had finished tasting, now they could move on to more serious drinks. She made another glass with this alcohol, and putting it in the middle of the table, asked the knights who would be next. The people were surprised, for they did not understand how she could make him drink again. It was unacceptable to treat a royal person in such a way. At this moment, Elle remembered the words of her commander who said that if she made one wrong move, she would lose her head. So she became anxious and realized that if it went on like this, all the knights, including her, would be in great trouble. But Lady Laurel in turn took the glass in her hands and said that since no one else would, she would be the one to ask. But at that moment, Lady L emptied her beer glass and asked that they wait before starting. Everyone immediately looked at her in surprise, and the girl in turn said that from now on she would be Theodore's dark knight, and took that glass of strong alcohol in her hands. Elle thought about the fact that for the sake of overall safety for Theodore, she had decided that the best solution would be for her to drink. Many hours had passed since then, and at last it was dark outside. Elle and Morris went out on the veranda to get some fresh air. The man saw that she was barely on her feet and asked if she was all right. The girl didn't even raise her head and said not at all okay. If he ever drank a Laurel cocktail, he would surely understand her. But Maurice smiled and said that in the end she had only had a few drinks. The girl looked at him angrily and wanted to say something. She was silent for a while, trying to remove the urge to throw up, and said that even if he hadn't said anything, he would still have made up his opinion of her. The man was a little confused about what she was talking about, but said that it was probably true. He also said that as soon as the girl grabbed a glass, and not every now and then rushed with strange questions, everyone immediately started asking how long they had been together, and kept trying to get the girl drunk. Morris put his head down and apologized for his subordinate. He said that even though he'd scolded her for it, she'd gotten completely out of hand now. But Elle looked at him and told him to just forget it, because truth be told, if it wasn't for Lady Laurel, Theodore wouldn't have been able to fit into this company. The atmosphere was very tense the whole time. Maurice looked at her in surprise and asked if she really understood him then. The girl laughed and asked what else there was to understand. That day, thanks to the alcohol, they had finally all gotten closer. She put her arm around his shoulder and told him that tomorrow they would meet on the beach and get even closer. Maurice felt a little uneasy, and he asked her to let him go already. When the girl did so, she sighed heavily and said that she remembered perfectly well the part he had played in all of this. The man felt a little uncomfortable, and he put his head down and said that it was only once. But Elle said that it was his punishment for failing to take responsibility and allowing himself to be manipulated by others. Moreover, he couldn't even handle his subordinates, so she chose a special punishment for him. When the girl said these words, she moved closer to him, and they were suddenly very uncomfortable. They heard a noise coming from the open door of the tavern. Elle immediately ran over there, and when she got inside, she wondered what they were having. She saw people pouring more glasses and standing next to Theodore. The men immediately started making excuses, telling the deputy commander that they were definitely trying to stop Lady Laurel, and they didn't understand if he had such a bad tolerance for alcohol, then why they had to agree to drink. Theodore was lying head down at this point and was definitely unconscious. Moore, with whom the girl had come in following, asked how many laps she was going to make them run tomorrow in practice as a punishment. Elle was so embittered that her body was shaking all over. Then she started calling all her team idiots and other foul words, realizing that they had made the greatest mistake that could cost her her life. At this very time, Princess Pippin was sitting in her study at the manor house, sorting out some papers. Suddenly someone knocked on her door, and she let them in. Then a maid came into the study and told Her Highness that it was too late, and that it was time for her to go to bed. The girl looked at her in surprise and said that she was not tired yet. But the maid replied that she was the future of this country, and she must go to bed early to grow big. Princess Pippin immediately got up from her table and said that she understood now and was on her way, since she was so insistent. But before leaving, the girl looked up at the night sky and even stopped. The maid immediately asked if something was wrong, to which the girl smiled and replied that everything was fine. Princess looked up at the full moon that was visible in the sky and thought about how Lady Elle must be having a lot of fun right now. But that was not what was happening in the tavern. Ellie had to take Theodore in her arms and carry him all the way home. It was incredibly heavy. She was already having a hard time because it was so huge, and the weight was adding to it. And she'd had too much to drink, and she was wobbling from side to side. As she dragged Theodore on her back, she suddenly looked at the knights who were watching the whole thing and thought about how utterly useless they were. In fact, about 10 minutes before all of this, people were talking about how they couldn't touch him. They were talking about how they were too clumsy and might drop it, and then the gentleman would break his head. The other man said that if they even lousy a single drop of his body, anyone would blow his head off. So they said that they could only hope for Lady Elle, who was incredibly strong and would completely handle it. That was why the girl was taking Theodore to her back, and she needed to carry. She thought about what was easy to say, but incredibly difficult to do. At that moment, Maurice came up to her and suggested that he help her too. The girl, seeing him, was immediately pleased and thanked him. Then they put Theodore on the ground and, putting his arms around their backs, went on their way. When they had walked some distance, the girl sighed heavily and said that she hadn't thought he would be so heavy, and added that apparently she was too drunk and had lost half her strength. The man laughed at that moment. She looked at him in surprise and asked what made him laugh so much. Was he drunk too? But Maurice replied that he had never thought he was helping the wild dog Claremont. He actually thought Idor would never return to the capital, and it was incredible to imagine that they could become so close that he, drunk, would be led home. Ella thought at that moment that she had once felt that way too. They threw the man into the back of the carriage, and Elle said that the princess and the princess had asked her to take Theodore's patronage, so she was obliged to do all this. And she thought about the fact that now she also had no choice but to try not to disappoint them, because otherwise it would be too bad. For some time they were silent, and then the girl said that in the end Theodore was in such a state, perhaps she could already say goodbye to the princess and in general to her life. Maurice, when he heard her gloomy thoughts, told her to calm down a little and stop thinking about it. He also said that if she was so worried about it, she could personally take Theodore home and then come back here. The princess, on the other hand, he said, is with the Blois family, so it would be great if she went and explained everything herself. When the girl heard about it, she was very surprised. But then she remembered that indeed, their families were friends, and she thought it would be a good idea. She pondered for a while, then, turning to Maurice, said that if so, why don't they go together? He opened the doors for her, however, and told her to be careful on her way, pretending that he had not heard her words at all. The girl at this point thought that he was still the one up to his hands. Even if he was just joking, he could at least play along with her. But she couldn't stay mad at him for long. It wasn't his fault after all. Shortly thereafter she started to climb into the carriage and said that in that case she would go alone. But Maurice stopped her suddenly and told her not to forget the lives of their knights who had drunk Theodore to such a state. It was in her hands now. The girl became very serious and said that he knew her very well after all. So he didn't have to worry about it. She would do her best to keep everyone alive. And when she was already in the carriage, she turned to the coachman and said they could go. The man set off at once, and Maurice stood watching the carriage move away. Then he smiled and sighed, thinking that perhaps he too should get to work on getting things in order. So he decided to go back to the tavern to deal with any issues that might arise. But as soon as the man stepped inside, he was immediately jumped on by one of the knights and asked if he could help him. He said something about Lady Laurel in a shaky voice. But he also pointed at all the people who were completely drunk, some even burping. Everyone else was asleep or mumbling something. The men could drink no more, and the girl in her turn made them all drunk with her magic drinks. And when Maurice saw this, he was very surprised, for he thought it would never happen again. But she made all the knights drunk again. Then he approached the girl who was just giving another mug to the drunken man, and said it was getting late, and it was time to go home. The girl, when she saw him, immediately dropped her glass and ran up to him, fire in her voice, saying that she was very glad to see him. Maurice felt a little uneasy, and he assumed that she had drunk too much alcohol. The girl was silent for a while, then suddenly said he was just a jerk and grabbed him by the shirt, wondering how he could even do that to her. The man looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she meant, and the girl continued to scream and said that because of him, she had wasted such a beautiful life. Maurice was horrified and could not understand how much she had drunk. The girl continued to scream for a while. Then, calming down a little, she took her hands away and said that she liked him very much, unbelievably much, and there was nothing she could do about it. She sat down on the chair with her head down and said she would never leave him and started calling him an idiot. The man looked at her in surprise, and then saw her eyes closing and she fell asleep. Then she said in a quiet voice that if everything had happened like that, but she still forgave him, but then suddenly realized that it was impossible to leave it like that, and said that she would never forgive him and hated him with all her soul. Maurice smiled when he heard that, and thought about the fact that Lydia Laver had apparently had too much to drink. However, for this day, he would forgive her. At this very time, Elle was riding in the wagon with the sleeping Theodore, who was sitting in the other seat. She was looking out the window the whole time. The girl noticed the silhouettes of the town nearby, and realized that it wouldn't be long before they arrived at the estate. Then she shifted her gaze to Theodore, whom she had covered with a blanket to keep him warm, and realized that he was sleeping quite comfortably in the cramped cubicle. It had never really happened to Francois, and she did not know what it was. He had told the girl that wine was a real treasure, and it was better when she drank it with him. The girl always pretends like everything is fine, but she herself can't believe this truth yet, that he really broke the engagement on her. A lot of things are piling up, but still at night this thought haunts her. After all, she had loved him for so many years without reciprocity, and perhaps it was natural that they had even broken up in the end. In fact, Elle still loves him with all her heart, and she's incredibly hurt by the way he did to her, and she just can't let it all go and let it go. But at that moment, her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Theodore, who woke up and said that he was incredibly hot. The girl immediately turned her attention to him. She smiled, thinking about the fact that thanks to him, she hardly had time to be sad about it, because he was always getting into some kind of trouble. Theodore, in turn, began to unbutton his shirt, and after that he even started moaning, all the while saying that he was hot. When the girl noticed this, she was very surprised. When she saw him unzipping his pants, she started screaming, calling him an idiot, and asked him to keep them on. But at that moment, the carriage hit a small rock, causing them all in the carriage to be jostled. She fell straight into Theodore's arms because she was standing up instead of sitting down. She was too embarrassed, and she realized that she had just almost gotten into trouble. Then she put her hand on his chest, told him she was going back to her seat for a more comfortable ride, and she was about to move away, when suddenly his hand grabbed her arm. Theodore's grip was quite strong, even though he was drunk. The man moved the girl in one motion to his seat and got on top of her. Elle looked at him in surprise and wondered what he was doing. The man ran his palm over her cheeks and called her mistress in a quiet voice. The girl was wary and thought that maybe this guy was too drunk and the alcohol was just talking in him. Then she thought to herself that if this was all really true, things were bad, for he had been willing to do terrible things to her then when he was perfectly sober. What to say when he couldn't control himself? Then she moved a little farther away from him and turning to Mr. Theodore, asked him to stop, for she was saying it nicely, and he had better not know what might happen if he did not. The man had his shirt unbuttoned and said he was only asking her once. Elle was very wary and did not know what he wanted to ask of her, for he was a very unpredictable man. Ella held his hand at this point to keep him from approaching, kept her distance, and thought about the fact that she was probably so drunk that from afar he seemed handsome enough. But looking at him up close, he seemed so much more handsome. But then suddenly the girl realized that these thoughts weren't going to lead to good things, and thought about how she was completely losing her mind, not understanding how she could think of such a thing. Elle turned to Theodore and asked him to calm down for starters. She understood everything perfectly well, so he could take it easy. But the man only moved closer to her and said it was just like his dream. He put his hand on her throat, running his fingers gently over her skin, and said that she was completely in his power now. And it really did look like a dream. He started to move closer to kiss her. Ella thought all the while that there was no way she could let this happen, and asked him to come to his senses, and herself as well. And then, when Theodore was already an inch from her lips, she finally realized what was happening and quickly pulled his face away from hers. The girl blushed and realized that she was on the verge of making a mistake, but Theodore was not confused, began to kiss her palm, and after that even licked. Elle was certainly pleased. However, she realized it was all a mistake, so she asked him to stop. She realized that this was not how it should be at all. After all, nights were the most pure. And that was true. The man leaned closer to her and was about to kiss her on the lips. But at that moment, she heard the coachman's voice saying that they had finally arrived at the Claremont estate. She opened her eyes at once and realized that she had to do something. Then she heard someone's voice addressing the Lord, and that voice didn't understand why he wasn't answering. Ellie, in turn, covered Theodore's mouth so that he wouldn't make a single sound. The man who had come to meet Theodore turned to the coachman and said that it was simply unbearable, and asked if he could just open the door instead of just standing there. The girl also heard the Countess's voice and became wary. Then the coachman turned to the gentleman and said that he was opening the door. Elle realized that this would not lead to good, so she quickly pushed him down. The coachman immediately jumped back and didn't even have time to touch the handle, and the Duchess was suddenly very frightened and asked what that sound was. Then the carriage door slowly opened and a girl appeared. When the Duchess saw Ella, she was very surprised. She herself walked up to her and, kissing her hand, greeted the Duchess by telling her that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Emily, for her part, was still surprised and said that it was indeed so, and she was very glad to see her. But after that she smiled and said that she had wanted to meet her and was now insanely glad that she had. Emily also said that it was getting pretty late and wondered why she shouldn't stay the night. Elle replied in a stern voice that she couldn't do that because she still had things to do, so she would decline the opportunity. At this moment Rosie's coachman ran to the carriage, and turning to the gentleman asked what had happened to him at all. Theodore at this point was sitting on the floor with his nose smashed and his torso covered. You see, his shirt was unbuttoned. Elle at this point began to worry and realized that there was no excuse for all this, a sign that there would be no pardon right in his face. Besides, the king's sister, Duchess Amelia, had obviously already seen everything. The girl was very surprised and asked why Theodore suddenly had a bloody nose. Amelia, at that moment, mentally asked for their forgiveness and realized that in the end, she had not been able to save anyone. Amelia, in turn, went to the coachman who had started to pull Theodore out and said that he must have fallen during the ride. They began to lead him toward the manor, and Ella still couldn't believe that the lives of the knights, including hers, had been saved. The Duchess was silent for a while, then said that it was far more important for her to know why her son was half naked, and then Elle realized that her life was hanging in the balance right now. Then Amelia looked in her direction and said that she would like to hear from her personally what had happened, and if possible, right now. The girl thought at that moment that she certainly couldn't have things too easy. Mrs. Amelia said that it was too late, so it was better to go inside. The girl had nothing else to do, so she obeyed, and they went to the manor together. Then she turned to one of her aides and told him to go immediately to the place where the knights were staying and inform them that Lady Elle would be staying with them that day, for it was too late to return. And besides, she had a lot of explaining to do. Elle at that moment mentally turned to Maurice and thought that when she died, he should take care of everything, because he was pretty good at it. Soon they had all entered the manor, and the lady handed Theodore to the maid. She also turned to Ella and told her that, except for the servants and them, no one else lived in the manor, so all the lights were out at night. She was walking with a candle, and as she escorted the girl, who had already changed into her pajamas, she said that this place was very dark, so she should be careful not to bump into anything by accident. As she followed her mistress, she thought about how incredibly strange this was, for she thought she wouldn't even blink an eye as her head flew off her shoulders. But instead, the Duchess behaves contentedly, and has even provided her with pajamas, and leads her, apparently, to her room where she will spend the night. They were soon in the drawing room, and Amelia, closing the door behind her, told Lady Elle that now that there was no one else in the place but them, she must be honest with her. The girl was incredibly worried and realized that in the end there was no escape from this, so she was already preparing to tell really the whole truth. But at that moment, the Duchess wondered in a worried voice if Theo was being bullied at work. When Elle heard that, very surprised. If she thought about the fact that he had been drinking a bit after all, since she was the main star of the evening. However, she wasn't sure if that counted as bullying. But Amelia explained her suspicion by saying that when she was helping Theo walk to the manor, she noticed bruises on his neck. She could see no other explanation but the aftermath, as if someone had pressed hard on his neck. Elle thought at this moment that it was no surprise after all, she had indeed forcefully tried to appease him. However, she couldn't tell Mistress. The woman, in turn, kept talking and said that this was not all. The child usually doesn't drink, but now he's drunk to the point where he can't even walk. Although sometimes the bosses forced him to drink. But it had never been to such a state. She asked if maybe it was just his bosses that made him drink so much. Then she looked at Ella, who had been silent the whole time, and asked if she thought she was exaggerating. The girl replied that she didn't think so at all, and it was quite normal for a mom to be worried about her son. Amelia suddenly put her head up and down and said that she was in a constant state of anxiety. After the inauguration ceremony, Theo had to leave his post and travel the world as a knight. She didn't even know if he was alive or not until he finally returned home, and now that all she does is wait for her husband, that feeling is compounded even more. Elle, when she heard this, was immediately surprised and thought that surely she must be referring to the Earl of Claremont. He was actually a glorified knight, but one day he just disappeared, so she doesn't even know if he's alive or not. There's no news of him. But then suddenly Emily took the girl's hand and said that Theodore had once told her that he had only come back because of Lady Elle. The woman smiled and said that was why she wanted to thank her for it, and told her thank you from the bottom of her heart. When Elle heard that Theodore had only come back because of her, she was very surprised. After everything that had happened there, she didn't understand why he had done it in the first place. At that moment, Amelia turned back around and said that she would make a hangover chowder tomorrow morning. But for now, she needed a good rest, so she was leaving her alone. Also, before leaving, the Countess told her that the place was full of empty rooms, so she could choose anyone she wanted. She also wished her good night and said they would see each other in the morning. And so, when Elle was left alone in total darkness, she didn't understand what she should do. The Duchess had only one candle, and she was clearly not going to share it. When she looked out the window and noticed that the moonlight allowed her to see a little in the dark, she walked under the wall so she wouldn't fall and held on to it. Ella decided to go into any room that had enough light. Then she stopped near one of the closed doors, thinking that this had been a very busy and long day anyway, so she wanted to get to bed as soon as possible. She opened the door and thought about the fact that she had to go back in the morning so she should get some sleep. But as soon as she opened the door, she saw the silhouette of a man lying on the bed. In the moonlight, Elle could see that it was Theodore. She felt immediately uncomfortable, because she realized that of all the empty rooms, it was Theodore's room that she had entered. So the girl quickly hid behind the other half. But she was actually surprised to see him sitting on the bed, because she thought he had been asleep for a long time. She looked out once more and didn't understand what he was even doing, for the man was just sitting on the bed, staring blankly somewhere off to the side. She took a closer look at his expression and didn't understand why it was so sad. Elle remembered what the Duchess had said, that he had come back for her, and Ella suddenly had the feeling that she'd just seen something she shouldn't have. The man covered his face with his hand, as if he were going to cry. Suddenly she felt her stomach rumble, and she couldn't help but think that he had really only come back from his wanderings because of her. At that moment, the girl remembered how at her inauguration, Princess Pippin ran up to her and said that the alarm, she was asking for Ella to help Theodore. The princess tearfully said that the only one with the fortune to stop him was only her. The man stood in the middle of the inauguration hall with a sword and killed everyone. Princess Pippin started yelling at him, asking him to calm down. Seeing this, the cadets and she didn't understand what he was doing. Elle, in turn, walked slowly toward him, but said nothing. He immediately looked at her, bloody and smiling. The girl, seeing the blood on his face, immediately started yelling at him. She was worried that it might be his, but the man, fixing his hair, replied that it didn't belong to him, so she didn't have to worry. He seemed proud of what he'd done in the first place, and looking at the girl, wondered if she was finally worried about him. Elle continued to yell and wondered if he had completely lost his mind in a situation like this. Why would she be worried about him? But the man only smiled and asked that she just let him think that, for he really thought she was the one who was worried about him. Theodore lifted his head up and with a smile on his face said that because he was in a very good mood today and he didn't want to spoil it with some platitudes. After that, the girl suddenly had a rather familiar place in front of her eyes. It was among the sakura trees, and she saw the silhouette of a man standing nearby. When the girl looked more closely, she saw that it was Francois. She wanted to make sure it was definitely him, but one wheel was completely out of sight, so she didn't know for sure. But at that moment the man suddenly turned his face, and she saw that it was not Francois at all. He smiled and looked her straight in the face. He reached her hand forward and asked just once. The girl was very surprised that he was starting to say it again, and then wondered what it could even mean. He began to move even closer, and the girl really hoped he would stop now and not trespass on her personal boundaries. Then she screamed his name in horror and woke up immediately. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Theodore right in front of her, asking her to correct herself. After all, he had told her to call him Theo. Aaliyah looked at him in surprise, and the man in turn said hello to the mistress. She even hid him from surprise so that the guy rolled off the bed. Some time passed from that moment. Theodore got up and opened the curtains, saying that he had come to wake her. But she slept so peacefully that he dared not disturb her beautiful sleep. Ellie covered herself with the blanket and said that whatever the reason, she wondered what he was doing in her bed in the first place. Theodore, smiling, looked at her. He still had the imprint of her hand, for she had hit him hard, and said that because the mistress had called his name incessantly. That was why he had come. The girl wondered what he was talking about, and then remembered her dream, and couldn't believe she'd actually said it out loud enough for him to come to her room. The girl even blushed from embarrassment. Then she asked him to stop talking nonsense and leave as soon as possible before someone saw them. Theodore agreed to leave. However, he said that before he did, He asked that she answer why she had called him by name so desperately in her dream. He moved up to her ear and asked her what she had done to him in her sleep that she had screamed so loudly. But Ela didn't want to put up with any more of this, so she hit him with a pillow and told him she wanted to change. So he had to leave the room immediately. Theodore had nothing more to do. He went out. Soon the girl was packed, and they went downstairs together for breakfast. Mrs. Emily was already sitting at the table, which was full of various foods, and said that breakfast consisted of simple dishes. She turned to Ella, however, and told her to eat it all with gusto. The girl herself, who didn't even want to come to the table, said that it was all a bit much, but Mistress only smiled and said that she needed a refreshment to have enough energy for the whole working day. Theodore was already sitting at the table and ready to eat breakfast. Emily said that she was working at the knight's residence now, as far as she could remember. She said with a smile, so it had been a while since she'd seen any members of the Blois family. So if it was okay with her, she wanted to get together like this more often. Ellie in turn came over and began to sit down at the table. The girl thought about the fact that the capital residence had been sold to the country, all along, and it had been a long time since she had been at such breakfasts, so she thanked and said she really appreciated such care. As Allie took her seat, she glanced at Theodore. She thought about the trouble he had caused her since the previous day. But now he looked so calm, as if nothing had happened. It was a rather disturbing moment. It would have been much worse if only she'd been able to stop him last night, and thought about the fact that the idiot couldn't even contain himself. But then, she supposed that from his reaction one would think that he had simply forgotten everything that had happened the previous evening, for he had not said a word about it in the morning. But actually she's even better off if he doesn't remember anything. Won't have to figure it out for a very long time, that and have those awkward conversations. The girl sighed heavily, and when Emily saw it, she wondered if she was so worried about something, because she really did look serious and tired. Ellie thought about the fact that, of course, she couldn't tell the Countess that it was her son she was worried about, so she simply replied that it was no big deal. It wasn't worth the dialogue at all. Madame inquired if perhaps she was uneasy because of the deputy commander's many duties, then offered her a taste of tea that was made from leaves he had sent from the east. Elia took her advice and started drinking right away. When she tasted the first sip, she marveled. Apparently this tea had a really unique flavor. She said that if they were talking about the East, they were talking about the uncharted continent on the other side of the ocean. Emily smiled at her look of admiration and said, "That's right. That's where he's from." The woman also said that for a very long time, the Round Empire had wanted to establish trade with the eastern lands. However, they did not want to cooperate because of pirate invasions from the west. Emily also said that their relationship had then developed to the point where she could now safely sip tea from those lands, and she was sure it was all thanks to the efforts of her older sister, their empress. Suddenly, a maid came into the room and addressed the mistress. She immediately turned and asked what had happened, for she looked worried. The maid presented the letter on a tray and said she had just received it. Emily was surprised, but she took it right away. Then she looked at the envelope and noticed that the letter was addressed to Lady L. She wondered why it had been delivered here in the first place. When she handed it to the girl, Elle immediately noticed that there was a royal seal. She assumed it was probably from the princess. It said that she hoped the girl had a good time at the Countess's house. Elia was immediately worried, not understanding how she could even know about it. But then she made an assumption about the person who might have told her all this, and sighed heavily. At this very time, the warriors had already gathered for training. When Elle returned, she brought Marissa an envelope. He was very surprised when he read the contents, and asked if there was really going to be a surprise party. The girl said that she received an invitation letter from the princess in the morning. She said that she was planning to organize a grand event that everyone could attend, regardless of their status, and she was also included in the list. Of course, even those who don't have an invitation can make it to the party if they go in pairs with those who do have that invitation. Maris read it, and said that it was a very unusual event, especially since a large number of people from different walks of life would be gathering in the capital. But Ellie, wiping away the sweat after practice, said he could worry less about that. So as not to particularly complicate matters, invitations were sent out at random. And then she turned to Maris and told him that he would accompany the princess to this party, instead of her. When he heard that, he was very surprised and asked why she had made that decision. Ilya sighed heavily and said that it was a normal escort, so there wouldn't be any danger. However, he would still have to keep an eye on the princess. Maurice turned to her with a nervous smile and asked if she had forgotten that his main job was paperwork, not escorting nobles like Princess Pippin. Besides, it's her duty as the princess's guard to accompany her to this party, so she can't pander to him. Alice sighed heavily and said that the letter had said that the princess wanted to invite Adelaide to the party, and he knew her situation just fine. She doesn't know what this girl is planning. However, she is being over the top, so Ellie doesn't want to go to this party and won't go there. But then suddenly the guy wondered if that was really the real reason why the girl didn't want to go there. At that moment, Elias suddenly heard some strange sounds in the neighborhood, and turning around, she was very surprised. Then she turned to Morris and asked him what it was all about. Drunk guys were walking towards her, and they were telling the girl that they were in a very unpleasant situation. In fact, they couldn't even walk. They were staggering from side to side, and it looked like they were about to vomit. Maurice in turn said that the cases of the knights who were no longer able to run were there. In fact, they were all lying on the ground and really couldn't do anything else. Ali sighed heavily and said that he was exaggerating, because they had only run a few laps, so they should be fine. She also said she thought they were all ready for this. After all, they were so excited yesterday. But one of the knights was indignant and said that it was all Lady Laurel's fault, and they had nothing to do with it, for she had gotten them drunk. The girl said that's why she was doing laps with them too. The boys were whining a lot and said that they definitely couldn't keep up with the two running ahead of them. They would rather die than be able to do it. Maurice, who was sitting on the sidelines watching, thought he was right. Even though the two of them were dead drunk, they looked like monsters who could see the target but couldn't see the obstacles. They were referring to Theodore and Lady Laurel, who were running the fastest so that they could sooner fulfill their norm and already go to rest. Despite the sweat and fatigue they felt, the boy and the girl did not stop. Then Elle suddenly said that it was all her fault. As long as they didn't say it was too much for them, she would increase the intensity of the training next time, so that it wouldn't seem so difficult for them. Maurice, when he heard that, thought about her being a monster too, since she could be so awake after a night like that. The warriors immediately jumped on the girl and talked about how she just couldn't do that and asked her to save them. Another man grabbed her leg and told her that he was hungover, even if he was just lying on a log, and she was making him do such strength training. Elle immediately started yelling at them and asked them to let go, and asked where their knightly pride had gone. She did not intend to tolerate such inappropriate behavior either, so she immediately hit some of the guys right in the face with her knee. Maurice at this point thought that since he too was having a hard time, perhaps he could help them out in some way. So when he turned to the deputy commander, he said he remembered that the commander had asked her to come to his office right after morning training was over. Ellie, who had been trying to push these guys away from her, immediately wondered if this was really true. The girl was even a little wary when she heard this, for she did not know what the commander could have wanted from her since morning. But she quickly left the knights and went straight to him. The commander, as soon as he saw that she had come, said that he had actually invited her because he wanted to tell her something very important. Elle was immediately alert when she heard it. She came closer and wondered what it could be, and thought that perhaps something important had happened, since he had invited her so early. The commander became very serious and said that a bottle of wine had gone missing from his office last night, and asked if she had any thoughts or speculation about it. Ellie sighed heavily and rolled her eyes, asking if he had called her in just for this case. But the commander was indignant and asked why she wasn't paying attention. He also added that he hadn't even tasted a drop of this wine, and she was being so disrespectful to this important matter. But the girl only turned around and said that she still had a lot of things to do, so since that was all, she would be on her way. When the commander immediately stopped her and told her that this wasn't really the important case he had called her in for, It was certainly important too, but there was more. Ellie, who was about to leave, said she wasn't going to be fooled anymore. However, the man said that last night he showed up, the Marshmallow Man. When the girl heard this, she was immediately interested. She turned around and looked at the commander in surprise. She couldn't believe it was true. Aaliyah walked over to his desk and motioned for him to continue if it was really about this man. The commander replied that he had a special assignment last night, to deliver the princess's pendant. Apparently, someone really wanted to steal it, and somehow even found out about it. The girl wanted him to get straight to the point and asked if he had managed to steal that pendant. The commander laughed and wondered who she even thought he was. He was very disappointed to see successfully delivered the jewelry right into the princess's hands. However, unfortunately, he was unable to catch the thief. When Aliyah heard this, she was very surprised, because even the commander could not catch him, and the man had already been in the business for a very long time. He said he searched the whole neighborhood after the incident. However, he disappeared like the wind, so it is not for nothing that he is called a marshmallow. In such a situation, it is only a matter of time before some of the Knights of November are trampled. They can no longer let some thief lead them around by the nose. Aaliyah was surprised and wondered what his idea was in that case, what they should do now. The commander smiled and said that he had found something interesting on his desk this morning. He pointed to a postcard and said that this guy would certainly not miss the opportunity to attend such an expensive event where there would be many aristocrats. When Aaliyah looked closer, she saw that it was an invitation from the princess. And the commander, smiling, said that the person who catches a marshmallow at this party will be rewarded with a year's salary. Aaliyah, when she heard about it, was immediately interested, because this is a very large amount of money, so she wanted to catch this thief even more. The girl then returned to her study, where she was sorting out some books, and Lady Laurel, sitting at her desk, looked at the stale bread and asked what it even was. Aaliyah replied that she had completely forgotten, because it was supposed to be her lunch. However, she didn't make it in time, and it just disappeared. The girl looked at her in surprise and asked if she was going to invent a new kind of poison, or smiled and said she could basically call it that. She explained that from now until the party started, she only wanted to eat spoiled food so that she would then have vomiting, diarrhea, which would be accompanied by stomach pains, and even allergies. And she could end up using it all as an excuse not to go to that horrible party. She packed some books with her and said that now that she wanted a year's salary as a reward, she didn't need it all anymore, so she certainly wasn't going to eat it. Lady Laurel immediately ran up to her when she heard about the party and asked if she really meant the party the princess was throwing. Aaliyah was a little surprised at her reaction, but said that she was right, she was talking about that party. Then the girl, with her eyes shining with joy, inquired how she looked upon her becoming the companion of dear Lady Ella. She would take very good care of her, and inquired what she thought of it. But the deputy commander didn't ponder long and said she was refusing to do that, because she was going to a party on an assignment. Lady Laurel was very upset, and said that it was the first time she would be able to attend such an event, for she was a commoner, and commoners like her would also come for the first time, and if not now, she would never have a chance to attend such an event again. She also said that because the invitations were sent out at random, now all she has left to do is impose herself on someone as a companion. So she straight up begged Lady L to take her herself, because she wants to dress up in a dress and be incredibly beautiful. Ali listened to all this for a while, and then, sighing heavily, she wondered if she wanted to go there so badly. Why didn't she just ask Maurice, since that man had also received an invitation? When Lady Laurel heard this, she was very much surprised. She immediately remembered what had happened the previous evening when she had confessed her love to him, and realized that it would be a little difficult to do so without embarrassment. The girl got too embarrassed and turned back around and said, as she remembered that she had to go on patrol, "Now I need time to chill and look for clues to catch the marshmallow," and asked that the mistress just forget everything she had said before. She walked out the door, saying at the end that she had a lot to do, so she would be on her way to get everything done as quickly as possible. Ella, as she watched this, was very surprised. She didn't understand why she had such a reaction, because as soon as she heard Morris's name, she immediately gave up and wasn't going to beg anymore, but just ran away. But then, she suddenly thought about the fact that if she thought about it that way, she should probably do the same thing herself. herself needing to take steps to catch the marshmallow as soon as possible. When the girl wondered why it was taking her so long to get the abandoned materials she had asked for ages ago. At this very time, Theodore was in the archives, and just wanted the guy who worked there to give him these materials. But the man was very frightened and, apologizing, said that, according to the rules, they could not issue such documents to an employee of his rank. Theodore became indignant, and said that these documents were not for himself. He was requesting them on the orders of his mistress, Lady Ella. The guy laughed nervously and said that in that case, according to the rules, Lady L should come and get them herself, since she had a high enough rank to do so. Theodore suddenly smiled lightly, and asked if he really wanted his mistress to run back and forth over nothing and waste time on such things. At this moment, the guy who worked there thought that really, as everyone said, smiling made him seem even bloodier. Apparently, he was really angry since he was acting like this. So he bowed and apologized, saying that he really wanted mercy and didn't want any punishment. But at that moment, Maurice's voice was heard behind him, telling him to take these documents on him. Then he turned to the employee, asking if it was even possible to do so, and also inquired if he could extend the time of issue on the book he was showing him. Some time passed from that moment, and the employee did agree to such a scheme. Then Theodore, together with Maurice, went about their business. The boy turned to Theodore and said that even though he was royalty, he should not threaten others. Theodore asked what kind of idiotic way of talking was this. Then he shifted his gaze to the book Maurice was holding, and said that he hadn't expected the boy to read such a thing. The one in turn smiled, and said that the second house was even more interesting, so he advised. Theodore, however, refused such a favor. At that moment they suddenly stopped because they heard loud laughter behind them. Theodore said that apparently the atmosphere was different from what they were used to in the corridors. Maurice, when he turned around, explained that everyone was now excited about the upcoming party. Especially this time there would be no class restrictions. And everyone was doubly excited, because not only aristocrats could go to the princess's party,